The call came in at 12:14 a.m., just as the embers in my stone fireplace were turning to ash and the freezing Sierra wind was rattling my Roseville kitchen window. The screen lit up with the name Audrey, my daughter. I swiped the screen with a thumb that still throbbed from a deep scrape I had gotten earlier that night. "Dad?" Her voice cracked, trembling in a way that made my chest tighten immediately. For a split second, my mind raced to her children, 10-year-old Mace and 8-year-old Abigail. "Audrey, what is it? Are the kids okay?" A long, heavy silence stretched over the line, filled only by the static of a bad connection. Then I heard her quiet sob. It was not the polite crying people do when they are embarrassed. It was real, chest-heaving crying. "Dad, why are they showing your face on the local news channel?" I looked up at the small television mounted above the counter. The volume was muted, but there I was. A 64-year-old retired bridge and highway inspector named Walter Vance, standing in a yellow emergency parka under the freezing rain, my forearm wrapped in bloody gauze. "Dad, I did not know," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking again. "I swear I did not know you were out there." And just like that, before she could say another word, I knew exactly what she meant. She did not know because 6 hours earlier, she had told me not to come for Christmas dinner. To understand how a father gets uninvited from his own family's Christmas, you have to understand the history. It did not start with a holiday dispute. It started 15 years ago when my ex-wife, Evelyn, decided she wanted a different life. During our divorce, Evelyn had quietly drained $180,000 from our joint retirement accounts to prop up the failing logistics startup of a man named Gerald Croft. My attorney at the time, Clara Jenkins, was sharp. She raised the legal doctrine of dissipation of marital assets in court. The judge was furious and credited that entire $180,000 back to my side of the ledger, forcing Evelyn to surrender her share of our remaining investments. Gerald's startup nearly collapsed as a result, and from that day on, Gerald Croft wore his hatred for me like a badge of honor. He eventually married Evelyn, and for 15 years, he did everything in his power to push me out of my daughter's life. He would schedule family events at the exact times he knew I was working, or convince Evelyn to host gatherings where I was explicitly excluded, creating a subtle but persistent barrier between my daughter and me. But Gerald did not stop at the divorce. 2 years ago, when my father passed away and left me a 5-acre redwood orchard in Placer County, Gerald saw an opportunity. While I was recovering in the hospital from a severe bout of pneumonia, Gerald forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, attempting to transfer the orchard to his own development firm. When I discovered the transfer, I did not raise my voice. I went straight to Clara Jenkins. She filed a civil complaint citing elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, paragraph 15610-30, and sent a formal demand letter pointing out that forgery under California Penal Code, paragraph 470, made the deed transfer void ab initio, meaning completely invalid from the very beginning. Faced with felony forgery charges and a massive civil lawsuit, Gerald backed down, signed the property back to me, and was forced to pay $45,000 in legal fees and damages. The friction was permanent, and Gerald's resentment deepened into a quiet, poisonous grudge that infected our entire family dynamic, which brings us back to this December. Audrey called me 3 days before Christmas. I was sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the box of handmade Christmas ornaments she had crafted when she was a little girl. "Hey, kiddo," I said, smiling. "Hi, Dad," she replied. I knew instantly. A father always knows. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Evelyn and Gerald are hosting Christmas at their new place in Lake Tahoe," she said, her voice dropping. "And, Dad, maybe it's better if you sit this one Christmas out. We're trying to make Gerald feel like he's part of the family after everything that happened with the lawsuit. He's still very hurt, and we want this Christmas to be peaceful." I stared at a crooked clay angel Audrey had made in the 2nd grade. I felt the weight of my 64 years settling heavy in my chest. "I understand, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice steady. I did not want to beg. If you have to plead for a seat at your daughter's table, that seat was never really yours to begin with. I hung up, looking at the silent house. I was 64, retired, and completely alone. The next morning I went shopping anyway. I bought gifts for my grandkids, a remote-controlled drone for Mason and a digital drawing pad for Abigail. But for Audrey, I prepared something different. I spent 2 nights at my dining room table organizing a leather-bound family photo archive. 30 years of memories, pictures of her first steps, fishing trips, graduations, and the day she married Jason Miller. I wrote a small note on the final page. No matter where I spend Christmas, you'll always be my little girl. I wrapped it carefully, loaded the boxes into my pickup truck, and decided to make the drive on Christmas Eve. Not to force my way in, but to perform my final duty as a father before letting go. I did not want to be a ghost in my own family, but I still wanted my grandkids to have their Christmas. I drove up the mountain toward Lake Tahoe, watching the snow begin to fall heavier against my windshield. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with the State Patrol warning of hazardous conditions, but I was determined to leave the packages before the storm blocked the roads completely. I wanted to drop them off and leave quietly, with no drama. I had no idea that before the night was over, the entire state would know my name. The mountain highway was already turning into a sheet of white by the time my old pickup truck climbed past Auburn. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy clumps, the kind that dampens all sound and makes the pine trees look like towering white sentinels. I kept my speed at 30 miles per hour, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel. Decades of working as a state highway inspector had taught me to respect the Sierra winters. You do not rush the mountains when they decide to freeze. I watched the temperature gauge on my dashboard drop steadily, eventually settling at 24 degrees. It was cold, the kind of dry, biting cold that seeps through the metal of your floorboards and makes your joints ache. My left knee, which had taken a beating from years of climbing concrete structures, was already throbbing in protest of the weather. My truck, a 2012 Ford F-150 with 180,000 miles, rumbled reliably, its heater fighting a losing battle against the freezing drafts. I arrived at Gerald and Evelyn's Lake Tahoe estate around 4:30 p.m. It was a massive modern mountain fortress of cedar and glass, perched on a ridge overlooking the water. The driveway was lined with expensive vehicles, their windshields already covered in a fresh layer of powder. I could see the warm glow of Christmas lights spilling from the tall windows, silhouettes of people moving inside, laughing, holding glasses. My grandkids, Mason and Abigail, were probably in there, excited about the snow, maybe sitting by the massive stone fireplace. I felt a familiar, hollow ache in my chest, but I did not let it linger. I had made a promise to myself, no scenes, no dramatic confrontations, just a father delivering his gifts. I did not want to make Audrey feel guilty, nor did I want to give Gerald the satisfaction of seeing me stand on his porch like a beggar. I parked my truck at the edge of the driveway, kept the engine in run, and stepped out into the wind. It hit me like a physical blow, carrying the sharp scent of pine and frozen lake water. I walked up the stone path to the front porch, carrying the cardboard boxes containing the drone for Mason, the drawing pad for Abigail, and the leather-bound photo archive for Audrey. I set them down carefully next to the front door, making sure they were protected from the wind. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the brass knocker. I could hear the muffled sound of music from inside, the clinking of glasses, and a voice that sounded like Gerald's laughing loudly. I almost knocked. My hand hovered over the brass for a long moment. But then I remembered Audrey's voice on the phone. "We want this Christmas to be peaceful." I lowered my hand, turned around, and walked back to my truck. The delivery took less than 2 minutes. It was the hardest 2 minutes of my life. I drove away with the snow piling up in my truck bed, feeling the weight of the separation. I drove back down the mountain, the snow falling heavier now, reducing visibility to a few car lengths. The road was covered in a thick layer of slush, and the wind was pushing my truck sideways. By the time I reached Colfax, my phone buzzed. It was an automated notification from the county emergency dispatch. The storm had upgraded to a blizzard warning, and they were requesting volunteer assistance for emergency road monitoring and support. I had remained on the county's volunteer reserve list after my retirement. The reserve program was a group of retired utility workers and off-duty road crews who helped out during severe weather events. We met once a year for training, but mostly we just showed up when the community needed us. I did not have anywhere else to be, no dinner waiting, no family expecting me, no holiday plans to rush home for. just a quiet house in Roseville that would feel too large and too empty on Christmas Eve. Volunteering gave me a sense of purpose, a way to focus my energy on something useful instead of dwelling on my own loneliness. I pulled over at a rest stop, texted my availability to the dispatch center, and was immediately assigned to a sector near a historical steel girder bridge over a deep rocky ravine on Interstate 80. I arrived at the volunteer station, put on my yellow emergency parka, and loaded my truck with safety flares, blankets, and a first aid kit. The wind was howling now, a deafening roar that shook the heavy pines. I drove my patrol route slowly, keeping an eye out for stranded vehicles or black ice. The road was treacherous, a sheet of packed snow and ice that had already claimed several cars. Around 9:30 p.m., I was parked near the approach of the old bridge when a call came over the emergency radio. A municipal transit shuttle bus, carrying 12 elderly residents returning from a holiday community service in Reno, had lost traction on the icy grade. The bus had slid sideways, crashed through the warning signs, and was now reported stranded on the bridge itself. I threw the truck into gear, turned on the yellow warning lights, and headed toward the bridge. As I rounded the curve, the headlights of my truck illuminated a scene that made my blood run cold. The bus was wedged at a dangerous angle, its rear wheels hanging precariously over the edge of the icy ravine, the concrete barrier cracked and crumbling under the weight. The metal of the bus was groaning under the pressure of the wind, and the vehicle looked like it could slide completely off the structure at any moment. I immediately activated my hazard lights, pulled my truck across the lane to block traffic, and grabbed my tools. I knew that every second counted, and my years of structural inspections had trained me for exactly this kind of emergency. I tightened the straps of my emergency vest, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the trembling bridge deck. The headlights of my pickup truck cut through the blinding sheets of snow, casting long dancing shadows across the old steel truss bridge. The shuttle bus was pinned against the damaged guardrail, its front end angled toward the center lane, but the entire rear section was suspended over the dark ravine. The wind was screaming through the steel girders, a high-pitched wail that sounded almost human. I parked my truck 50 feet away to avoid adding weight to the unstable structure, grabbed my flashlight and emergency gear, and stepped into the storm. The ice on the road was slick as glass, and I had to walk carefully, using my inspector's staff for balance. The structure beneath my feet was vibrating slightly, a subtle movement that only an experienced inspector would notice. It was a warning sign that the bridge was reaching its load capacity under the weight of the ice and the stranded vehicle. I could see the concrete spalling and the thermal cracks along the expansion joints, reminding me of the bridge's age. As I approached the bus, I could see the terror inside. The passengers, all elderly residents, were huddled near the front of the cabin, their faces pressed against the frosted glass. The driver was frantically trying to open the front door, but the frame had twisted during the slide, locking the door mechanism shut. I climbed up onto the side runner of the bus, tapped on the driver's window, and gestured for him to slide it open. "I am Walter," I yelled over the wind. "I am a retired highway inspector. We are going to get you out of here, but you need to listen to me carefully. Tell everyone to stay exactly where they are. Do not move toward the back of the bus. Any sudden shift in weight will pull this vehicle over the edge." The driver, a young man who was shaking with fear, nodded and turned to repeat my instructions to the passengers. My professional training took over, pushing the cold and the exhaustion aside. I shined my flashlight down at the bridge deck. The concrete barrier had fractured, and the main support beam directly beneath the rear wheels was showing signs of stress. I knew this bridge. I had inspected it 6 years ago. I knew that the structural joint near the expansion plates was the weakest point. If we did not move the passengers off the bus immediately, the concrete deck would give way. I ran back to my truck, grabbed a heavy iron pry bar, and returned to the bus door. The metal of the bus was freezing to the touch, and the howling wind was making it difficult to maintain my footing. It took 3 hard attempts, the metal groaning as I forced the pry bar into the doorframe. On the 4th try, the lock snapped with a sharp crack, and the door swung open. The cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying snow with it. "All right, we are going to exit one by one," I called out, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. Step exactly where I tell you to. The bridge deck is icy, and we need to avoid the cracked concrete near the barrier. I reached in, taking the hand of the first passenger, an elderly man who could write his own history of the county. I guided him down, step by step, directing him to the center lane where the steel supports were strongest. I made sure to support his weight, my boots finding grip on the small patches of gravel scattered over the black ice. Each passenger was assisted off the bus in this manner. The process was agonizingly slow, requiring all of my focus and physical strength. The wind was blowing sideways, and the freezing rain was starting to form a thick crust of ice over my parka and gloves. My hands were numb, and my shoulders ached from the physical strain. The last passenger remaining on the bus was 74-year-old Margaret Higgins. She was terrified, clinging to the seat handrail, her eyes wide with panic. "I can't do it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My legs won't hold me." I climbed into the bus, took her by the hands, and looked her in the eye. "Margaret, I have checked the structure. It will hold us if we move now. I will carry you if I have to, but we are leaving this bus together. Trust me." She took a deep breath, released her grip, and let me guide her toward the door. We had just stepped onto the bridge deck when I heard a sickening, metallic tear. The steel girder beneath the rear wheels groaned, and a 10-foot section of the concrete guardrail gave way, tumbling into the ravine below. The rear of the bus slipped another 2 feet, the metal scraping against the asphalt with a shower of sparks. The sudden movement caused Margaret to slip on the black ice. She began to fall toward the widening gap in the bridge deck where the barrier had collapsed. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing her coat collar and throwing her toward the center lane. The force of the movement sent me crashing down onto the jagged edge of the broken concrete. A sharp, white-hot pain exploded in my left shoulder as it dislocated under my weight. My right forearm scraped against a piece of twisted, rusted rebar, tearing through my heavy sleeve and slicing deep into the flesh. I lay there for a second, unable to breathe, the snow falling onto my face. But Margaret was safe, sitting in the middle of the highway. I could hear the sirens of the first responders echoing in the distance, their red and blue lights reflecting off the snow-covered pines. I managed to drag myself up, using my good arm to support my weight, as the lights of the fire trucks finally broke through the blizzard. I collapsed against the side of my truck, clutching my dislocated shoulder as the firefighters ran toward us. The paramedics arrived 5 minutes later, their emergency vehicles lining the bridge approach. They quickly secured Margaret Higgins and the remaining passengers, moving them into the warmth of the rescue vehicles. A young firefighter helped me up from the icy deck, his hand steady under my good arm. I was gritting my teeth, my left arm hanging uselessly at my sides, my shoulder screaming with every step. My right hand was stained with blood from the deep laceration on my forearm, the cold air making the wound sting like fire. They guided me to the back of an ambulance, where an EMT began wrapping my arm and preparing to pop my shoulder back into place. As I sat there, the back doors of the ambulance opened to the snow. A local news crew parked nearby. A reporter named Diana Albright, wearing a thick winter coat with the Channel 7 logo, walked over with a cameraman. She looked at me, her expression a mix of concern and professional interest. "Excuse me, sir," she said, gesturing to the camera. "We are live on the air. Can you tell us what happened here? The passengers are calling you a hero." I shook my head, letting out a dry, tired laugh. "I am no hero," I said, my voice hoarse from the wind. "I am just a retired inspector who happened to know where the bridge was weak. The first responders are the ones doing the real work." Diana smiled, leaning in. "Still, you were out here volunteering on Christmas Eve. You must have a very supportive family waiting for you at home to let you run out into a blizzard like this." I looked down at my bloodied arm, then out at the dark pine trees lining the highway. The physical pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the quiet, heavy realization that had been settling over me all evening. The exhaustion of 15 years of fighting for my daughter's attention, of enduring Gerald Croft's manipulations, of being pushed to the sidelines of my own life, finally caught up to me. I was too tired to lie, too tired to protect their reputation. I looked directly into the camera lens. "Not tonight," I said, forcing a small, tired smile. "I don't have anyone waiting for me. My daughter asked me not to come to Christmas this year. They wanted to make her mother's new husband feel more like family, so they decided it was better if I sat this one Christmas out. Diana's face went completely blank for a fraction of a second. She had expected a heartwarming holiday anecdote, not a raw, painful truth. She stammered a quick thank you and wrapped up the segment. The EMT popped my shoulder back in, a brief, agonizing flash of pain that left me lightheaded, and finished wrapping my arm. By the time they cleared me to go home, it was past midnight. I drove back to Roseville in silence, the truck's heater blowing hot air against my frozen face. I unlocked my front door, sank into my recliner, and turned on the television. The local station was already running the segment, my tired face appearing next to the flashing winter weather crawler at the bottom of the screen. That was when my phone began to vibrate. It did not stop. Within 20 minutes of the broadcast, the 20-second clip of my interview had been uploaded to the station's website. By 1 a.m., it had been shared 15,000 times. People were furious. The contrast between a 64-year-old retired inspector saving elderly passengers on a freezing bridge while being excluded from Christmas by his family was too sharp for the public to ignore. Comment section was a war zone. People were calling out my daughter, demanding to know who would uninvite their own father on Christmas Eve. Some comments even identified Gerald Croft and his local logistics business, linking his past corporate legal troubles to this display of family cruelty. Then came the calls. Audrey called first. Her voice was shaking, her crying raw and desperate. "Dad, why did you say that? Everyone is calling me. Jason's family saw it. My friends are texting me. Gerald is furious." I sat in the dark, my shoulder throbbing. "I only told the truth, Audrey," I said quietly. "You did ask me not to come, but you did not have to tell the whole world," she cried. "You ruined our Christmas." I looked at my wrapped wrist. "You chose your table, Audrey. I just chose to tell the truth about why my seat was empty." I hung up. 10 minutes later, Evelyn called, shouting about the damage to Gerald's reputation. I did not answer. I turned off the phone, closed my eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, I slept through the night without worrying about what they thought of me. I realized that my loyalty was no longer something they could demand while offering nothing in return. The morning brought a flurry of messages from neighbors, former co-workers, and people from church, all offering support and expressing shock at how I had been treated. A former colleague from the highway department, who had retired a few years before me, called to tell me how disgusted he was by Gerald's behavior and how proud he was of my actions on the bridge. Neighbors began knocking on my door, delivering hot soup and cookies. The story was spreading far beyond the local news, turning a private exclusion into a public conversation about how we treat our elders. Many online users shared their own stories of family estrangement, and the local news station ran a follow-up segment on the importance of community support during the holidays, cementing the public backlash against Gerald and Audrey. The clip was shared by national organizations, turning my quiet Christmas Eve into a symbol of standing up for elder dignity. I sat on my porch, drinking coffee, watching the snow melt from my lawn, feeling a strange but welcome sense of peace. I was no longer a secret they could sweep under the rug when it suited them. By the time January melted into February, the viral storm had quieted, but the landscape of my life had changed permanently. The public shaming had hit Gerald Croft's business hard. His local logistics firm had lost 3 major commercial contracts after several community leaders realized he was the stepfather who had pushed a retired volunteer hero out of his family's Christmas. Gerald had tried to release a statement calling me a disgruntled relative, but the local newspaper reporter, Victoria Stone, had done her research. She published an article detailing Gerald's past forgery attempt on my redwood orchard and the resulting elder abuse claim. The truth was out, and no amount of public relations could spin it away. Audrey tried to visit me 3 times in January. Each time I met her on the porch. I did not invite her inside, not out of anger, but out of a new quiet clarity. For years, I had allowed my boundaries to be trampled in the hope of buying her affection. I had accepted the crumbs of her time, paid for her vacations, and remained silent while Gerald insulted me. I was done begging. When she asked if we could go back to the way things were, I looked her in the eye and gave her a single word. Maybe. It was the same word she had used when she was deciding whether to exclude me. She looked confused, expecting me to soften. But trust is a bridge that takes years to build and only a single second to collapse. I was willing to let her do the work to rebuild it, but I was no longer going to carry the timber for her. In mid-January, I met with my attorney, Clara Jenkins, in her Roseville office. The room smelled of coffee and old paper. We spent 2 hours restructuring my estate. I did not cut Audrey out completely. She was still my daughter, and I loved her. But I established strict legal guardrails. I updated my will and created a restricted family trust. My Roseville home and 60% of my investments would be held in trust for my grandkids, Mason and Abigail, managed by a neutral corporate trustee to ensure Gerald Croft could never touch a single dime. The remaining 40% of my estate, including the Redwood Orchard, was deeded to the County Volunteer Search and Rescue Association and a scholarship fund for young construction apprentices. Signing those papers felt like a profound release. I later drove out to the Redwood Orchard, touching the rough bark of the trees my father had planted, knowing their future was secure from Gerald's greed. I felt a sense of connection to my father, who had worked hard to leave me this land, and I was glad it would go to people who respected my life and work. A week later, Audrey called, asking if I could help her and Jason with a $35,000 down payment on a new vehicle. In the past, I would have signed the check immediately. This time, I asked where their savings had gone. She hesitated, then admitted they had invested it in one of Gerald's real estate projects. "I am sorry, Audrey," I said, my voice calm. "I cannot do that. I am retired, and I need to stop solving problems I did not create. You should ask Gerald for the money." The line went dead. I did not feel guilty. I felt free. I had spent too many years acting as a financial safety net for a family that treated me as an afterthought. I was finally learning that a healthy boundary was not an act of hostility, but a necessary step for self-preservation. In late February, the State Emergency Service Associations held its annual honor ceremony in San Francisco. I was selected to receive the Life-Saving Valor Award for my actions on the bridge. The organizers had sent me 2 formal invitations, assuming I would bring my daughter. When Audrey found out about the event, she called me, her voice filled with hope. "I bought a new dress, Dad," she said. "I want to be there to support you." I looked out my window at the bird feeder in the yard. "Thank you, Audrey," I said gently. "But I have already filled my guest seat. I am taking Margaret Higgins." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Margaret?" she whispered. "The woman from the bus," I replied. "She has been volunteering with me at the food bank every Tuesday. She understands what it means to show up." The ceremony in San Francisco was beautiful, held in a grand hall overlooking the bay. I wore a charcoal suit, my shoulder fully healed, my arm showing only a faint silver scar. When they called my name, the crowd of 500 people stood and applauded. I walked onto the stage, took the medal, and looked out at the audience. Margaret was sitting at the front table, smiling and wiping a tear from her eye. In the back of the hall, I saw Audrey standing near the entrance. She had driven down anyway, watching from the shadows. She did not approach me afterward, and she did not try to interrupt my dinner with Margaret. For the first time, she seemed to understand that a father's love is unconditional. But his presence is a privilege. As we walked out into the cool San Francisco night, I felt the bay breeze on my face. The road behind me had been rough, but the path ahead was clear. I was no longer saving seats for people who only remembered me when the cameras were on. I was finally surrounded by people who valued my presence, not just my utility. I had found a community that saw me for who I was, and that was the greatest gift of all. I had finally learned that my worth was not determined by their acceptance, and that walking away was the only way to save myself. I was finally living on my own terms, and that was the best kind of peace I could have ever asked for.